Media is tasked with disseminating supposedly accurate, factual information. But we find ourselves today in media that the rise of fake news makes it very hard to distinguish what is true and what is not.
More than ever, we need journalists, editors, to sort the fake from the real, to verify, to check, to cast aside the hatred and the hate speech and seek truth. But we're in a terrible situation where the capacity of journalists to do that is undermined by digital, particularly social media, which has undermined a great deal of our newsrooms and their capacity to report, which is the way we try and find out what's going on, try and verify and try and get the information people need. So more than anything else, we need to rebuild a journalism that's trustworthy, that's credible, that verifies, that selects. And I think it was quite right earlier on to say social media is an incredibly valuable tool for journalists as well. But it's also a very dangerous tool because it can be abused and it can undermine those of us seeking truth as well.
Now, how do you do that in a world where somehow information is consumed very fast because of the smartphones technology, and also you need to be accurate at the same time? So you find that as a traditional mainstream media, you'll be competing for speed with, for example, citizen reporting.
So I believe that as journalists, social media can send stuff out as quick as it likes, and it always will. But as journalists, we need to take a breath, slow down, and say, check, verify. Our job is to separate the truth from the non-truth, the verifiable from the non-verifiable. You know, it relies on individuals in the sense that we are going to have to adapt to this world, and I believe be prepared to pay for the value of good, solid, credible information. That's a reality we have to face up to. And it relies on a society taking on the value of journalism, re-establishing the value of journalists and journalism and their work, and reinvesting to rebuild.
We've seen, was it Angelo Agrizi at the State Capture Inquiry talking about brown envelope journalism again? Some of us in the media space being bought to write certain stories, and those are credible platforms. So you also find that kind of influence still happening. So in the rebuilding, you have to bring in that moral, ethical integrity into the media, into the newsrooms.
There's no question we have to reassert the value of independent, critical, quality journalism. There have been instances where there's been brown envelope journalism. We now see some evidence of that, and we have to fight that in the same way, for example, that the accountants have to fight it in their profession, and the lawyers and the judges in their profession. We've had a rot in the society. Let's speak some truths. We had a rot in the society from the top that infused every profession, every part of our life, and we have to take that on, drive it out, and rebuild all of those institutions, including the media.
Fasiha, I saw a research recently by Deloitte. So 2018, they do this global research on millennials. And this time they included several hundreds of them from South Africa. Among other things that are common globally to millennials is a lack of trust in media. You don't trust us in media, do you?
I think I trust some things. But I have to agree with Anton that there's been, I think, a lack of enough verification and a lack of some element of ethical journalism. And you're quite right. I mean, it's across all industry. And for me, there's a few things. If I want to see what's going on in the world, one of the first things that I do is go onto Twitter, right? Because Twitter, in many ways, provides information faster than it is for me to watch ENCA on TV, for example. But that comes with some different elements, right? It means we have to sort through a lot of stuff to get to the truth. And there's a particular example I want to cite here. If anybody is aware, they had a huge problem in India, actually, with WhatsApp and the dissemination faster than the police could deal with it around fake news. And that what that actually caused was lynching of people in several villages. And WhatsApp actually had to come out, and I mean, it was like not just in newspapers, it was crossed to say, don't just forward information. In fact, I don't know if people are aware of this, but a few months ago, when you forward a message, it now says forwarded just on top of it. That was a result of kind of what happened in India, because people were just forwarding on all this fake information and all this stuff. And we also see it now. And the point that I also want to make is it's not just about journalists. It's about us as South African citizens. Just because Mang Mang or so-and-so sent me a video that they claim happened in CBD yesterday doesn't mean that it happened in CBD this morning. And me forwarding it on to all my various WhatsApp groups is part of the problem, because I'm also not verifying it. So for me, it is about mainstream journalists, but this thing of citizen journalism also comes with the responsibility, and it's not something we're talking about. It's not something that's permeated through. So as much as I now have power because I have this access to social media, I also have to be somewhat more responsible in the information I disseminate.
Judge Pillay, there are legal implications or consequences sometimes nowadays when you forward stuff or say things about people on social media.
The same restrictions that apply to offline speech applies to online speech. This is here and internationally. So all the restrictions and responsibilities lie. So I like what Anton said, that there is a responsibility not to be worrying about reputational damage first. Every institution first wants to cover up rather than acknowledge that an error has been made and they're going to investigate it. So that's a good point. It's the human rights and business and how you would operate them.
Just say quickly, you're absolutely right. Each individual's got to take responsibility about forwarding fake information and dangerous information and hate speech. But I think also as citizens, we need to force the platforms, Twitter, Facebook, to take more responsibility. They've started to take some, but we have to force them to take responsibility and make them accountable when they carry hate speech.
But before you carry or you even send something out, Professor, generally, you need to be taking a step back. Like Anton was saying, if you're in a newsroom, before you go out in terms of competing for speed and break the news, you need to be stepping back to verify the sources and the credibility of that story.
That's part of the traditional rule of journalism. There are sometimes cases where perhaps the decision by the editorial committee might be you don't want the truth to ruin a good story. But I think what Fasiha has said, it's important that we all take responsibility for the ecosystem we're trying to create. Because being a journalist is not just telling stories. It's not just communicating what's happening in society. Through what you communicate, you're building the society that will emerge. And you've got to decide what I'm putting out there. Is it building the society I want to live in? Is it building the world I want to live in?
We live in a world of very scarce resources or dwindling resources. Newsrooms, you mentioned capacity. We need to go back to those basic tenets of good journalism. But there are commercial pressures because you need to be sustainable. And sometimes those commercial pressures in media would lead you to do certain things. For example, if you want to get that advertising rand on your platform, some people will bring it if they like certain kinds of content. That plays a role as well currently in media in terms of truth, lies, and hope, does it?
It definitely does. The commercial pressures do a great deal to undermine the kind of independent quality journalism we seek and we're talking about. There's no question about it. We as a society have to find ways to support journalism that is as free as possible from that kind of economic pressure. That's why we have a public broadcaster that should be freed more from commercial pressure than it is. That's why a number of philanthropic foundations and individuals support investigative journalism that's not commercially viable but is important, and we're going to have to recognize as a society, business, for example, recognize the importance of that journalism, the importance in investing in that journalism.
Okay, Faith?
Well, thanks very much, Dan. I'm going to bring in Kate here from the South African National Editors Forum, because a lot of it lies within accountability. And maybe, Kate, as you come up, the question around the justifiability of saying that there is commercial pressure, does that not then take away the pressure from editors and does not take away from the newsroom that actually you need to be independent, you need to report on the truth and stop with the brown enveloping?
Yeah, absolutely. So the issue for SANEF, which I think is an important point to make, is that we in fact realize that there is a problem and have got an inquiry. So we've got an independent inquiry looking at credibility and ethics issues. And one of the major issues is around, where can we do better, even within the resource constraints that we find ourselves in. But the other huge issue, of course, is the issue of the economic constraints. And I think one of the big things to point out is just how few journalists there are. And if you look at that, it becomes very difficult to then go to the ground to actually find out, for instance, with the xenophobic looting, what actually was happening, to sit with communities, to sit with people and actually, find out those kind of ground up stories. So what we're hoping the inquiry is going to do is to look at things at a whole lot of different levels. What can we do better, on an ethical basis, but what can we do in terms of the resources? And again, I want to point out the issues around business. Business, at the moment, a lot of that money is going to Facebook and Google, a lot of that advertising funds. It needs to come back into the media, and we need to look at how do we do that.
Thanks very much for that, Kate. And then I'm going to bring in from the Nelson Mandela Foundation, Luzuko, just to speak around, issues of, and we're hearing this, especially when it comes to the role of the media and the important role in which we need to assume, especially being able to decipher truth, lies. But where lies the hope? Because I think that's what we're not talking about here. How do you think we speak about this issue around hope? Where is the hope, especially when it comes to media?
This inequality that exists in our society today, I think, has also been contributed to a lot by partly business, partly our politics, the media in the way that it reports on the stories, both of development and on the realities on the ground. You have quite a lot of our communities in rural communities underreported, and their stories not told in the way that make them feel part of a society that is growing and that is included. And I think that, for me, is something that we need to interrogate. How do we ensure that there's equal share, probably more tilted towards the more underprivileged part of our society, the majority of this country? And I think we need to start turning that deliberately. So when we talk about equity, when we talk about transformation, we need to start talking about how do we share with those who never got the share, who never got the equal slice of the cake, both from the historical past, but even in the current state of affairs. In that way, we are going to start igniting the hope. Madiba says about hope that hope is one weapon that no one can take away, even if they are the most powerful structure. And he says this in a letter that he writes to Mamawini in 1969. And I think he was trying to ensure that all of us remain hopeful. And I think if we can start thinking in that way, that we are complicit partly because of how we prioritize things, how it's convenient for resources and time, but also we can do something if we start reminding ourselves of where this country could have been had we done things differently.
Thanks very much for that, Luzuko. Dan, back to you.
Okay, as we conclude this media discussion, Anton, just to come to you, just to give you some parting words. Is it possible that we can reinvent ourselves to do some of what has just been shared that we need to be doing?
Oh, there's no question we can, we must, and we will. We have to remake the economic model that drives journalism. But as I said, when we're flooded with so much instant, unverified information, more than ever we need the people who verify, who select, who process. And we have to recognize that and find ways of giving that value and protecting it within our society.
And I guess one of the challenges sometimes on social media, something that is an opinion passes as fact and finds itself being quoted elsewhere, but it was just an opinion. Thank you very much, Anton, for your time this evening. Let's give him a round of applause. Thank you, Anton. You can go. Thank you very much. Now, to end off, we thought for each of you, our panelists, you are the main panelists, to share with us and the audience three things or three key points of how do you think we can get back the country on track in terms of what has been discussed? How do we fix things to make sure that going forward we deal with less lies and more truth and more hope?
I would say the first thing each one of us has to do is to model the society we want to live in by making sure that if we want our society to be founded on truth, justice, and reconciliation, we're the first to do that. I think one of the things that I have found is we often act in a way that seems to suggest that there are people who always tell the truth, and there are always people who do good, and there are people who are always doing bad things. And often some of the people we regard as good people lie sometimes and do bad things, and some of the people that have disappointed us so badly often do good things. And I think we have to call everyone to order whenever we need to, and people who do bad things, when they do good things, we should tell the truth about the good things they do. Somebody said truth won't matter to the ordinary person when they're hungry. You could be a thief, you could be telling them a lie that they know is a lie, but if they're going to be fed for one day, they will go with you. And that's what has happened with corruption and state capture. And going forward, I would say South Africa, Africa, and the world, let's join our hands to end poverty, totally end poverty by 2030 and reduce structural inequality during the same period.
Judge Pillay?
Well, I say let's use the right language. You see, we don't want information as a charity. We want full information on the budget, why they had to spend 250 million buying military aircraft when they could have used the money for houses. So if we have the rights language, as I said to what the students did during their protests, they had posters saying, do the poor not have the right to education? Now that's what I mean by plugging the right. We have a right to know what you're doing. We have a right to ensure that you are transparent, whether you are the media, business, or government. The other thing, and I learned this from the audience today, how troubled people are in saying they're afraid and they are intimidated. We saw this as we watched the Zondo Commission witnesses. One man was crying and weeping. He was so terrified of what will happen to him because two of his colleagues were killed. So we need witness protection laws immediately. We need to encourage anonymous sources. There are millions of South Africans sitting there who see violations on a daily basis and who can tell us about it now. So that mechanism must be created. It has to be created by government, and government has to be accountable to the people by the way, not doing their own thing for their own interest. I am hopeful. As I said, we are living in a democracy. We've got laws in place that spell out the values. We don't have to reinvent the values. And ordinary South Africans are fully aware of the values. That's why they don't like to be stereotyped, like Trump is doing to us, that we come from certain kinds of countries. You see, that's harmful stereotyping. Here, we have values and we can resist that. We don't want to be labeled as people who are xenophobic, that we hate foreigners. That's a stereotype. And we do have the skills to distinguish between fake news and real news, whether it's offline or online.
Thank you very much, Judge Fasiha.
This lack of honesty and integrity is not just something we've seen in politics, right? And today's discussion really has revealed that. But for me, it's also about society as a whole and about holding ourselves to that much higher standard. And yes, I'm speaking about society who, when you get stopped at a roadblock, that small Indiana bribe that people give to cops so that I can get away with it, that's where those things start. Right? When we fail to uphold the rule of law in our own lived realities, that it really becomes a much bigger example in other spaces. So for me, it's about more than just people in the public eye here. I think it's everyday people that we really need to also hold ourselves to a different standard. And also the other point I want to make, and you mentioned it earlier, about sometimes opinions come across as facts. Just because somebody keeps repeating something doesn't mean it's true. And because it keeps being repeated, people think it's true, without actually doing our own research and empowering ourselves with information, which I think we owe ourselves, not just as human beings, but also as South Africans, to safeguard this democracy. We leave it to civil society, we leave it to the media, when in actual fact it's us, as South African citizens, that really need to safeguard it. South Africans are living, breathing proof that we can overcome the insurmountable. And I think we often forget that. We forget that. Had you asked, I was not alive, but I've read about this thing in books and seen it in documentaries and stuff. if you had asked people like Baba Mavuso about whether we would have gotten freedom in the late 80s, a lot of those comrades and those activists on the ground would have said, obviously, this is what we're fighting toward, this is what we want, but we're not sure when it's going to, come. And yet 4 or 5 years later, we had this so-called peaceful democracy, this peaceful transition. Obviously, it wasn't that peaceful, but the fact of the matter is that it could have gone much worse. And we live and stand as breathing proof that we can overcome these things. So I think it's also to take a moment to take a step back. The situation is not irreparable. It's not something where we can't rescue it. In fact, we have to rescue it. Not just for myself and other young people, but my kids, your kids, our grandchildren can't grow up in a society that's so fundamentally challenged on an ethical level. We have to find a way around it. And for me, it goes down to the everyday person in your everyday life to really try and overcome it and hold ourselves to a different standard.
Well, it seems like there is hope from what we've had, but we do know that the media is challenged, business is challenged, our political leaders are challenged today, every single day, to discern between what is true and what is not true. But we are hopeful that we can all change. And as we've just heard, it is up to each and every one of us here. And ENC is doing its part to try and take us out of the current darkness that we are all facing into a hopeful future. Thank you very much for having been with us in this debate. Let's give our panelists a round of applause. And thank you very much to the audience as well. We appreciate you having participated in this debate.